Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your microphones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming Professor Judson Caskey. Professor Judson is a professor of accounting at the University of California, Los Angeles. He received his Ph.D. From the University of Michigan. Professor Caskey focused on both empirical and modeling research in financial accounting. He has been published in top-ranking journals, including the Accounting Review, Management Science, Journal of Accounting and Economics, Contemporary Accounting Research, Review of Accounting Studies, and the Review of Financial Studies. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Judson Caskey.
Well, thank you very much. So if you see me drinking coffee, I'm in Los Angeles right now, so it's still morning here, and hopefully there's not a new gamma version of COVID that can spread from Zoom. But in case that is true, I am vaccinated. So this, well, first, as Mohammed mentioned, feel free to just unmute and ask questions. If it gets chaotic, then we can look at a different system like raising hands and so on. But as long as it's manageable, I'm used to, as most of you are, regular workshops where people can kind of ask questions as you go along. As you can see, the paper is amendment thresholds and voting rules and debt contracts. For those of you who are wondering, like, is this accounting? No, it is not. It's definitely relevant to accounting because we spend a lot of time looking at debt contracts. For example, a lot of the technical default rules in debt contracts are based on accounting numbers, but this paper in and of itself, it's relevant to accounting, but it's not really an accounting paper, and we'll send it to a finance journal. It's co-authored with Kevin Huang, who's a PhD student at UCLA. He's going to be on the job market this year. He's been excellent to work with. And so if any of you are at schools that are on the market, I highly encourage you to take a very close look at his packet and invite him for an interview. And also co-authored with Daniel Saavedra, who is on the faculty at UCLA. Daniel has also been great to work with. If you're writing him a tenure letter, he's great to work with. If you want to hire him, don't. I want him to stay at UCLA. So with that, let's jump into the paper. Make sure the slides are for it. Okay. All right. So to look at the setting we have here, I included a quote from a credit agreement between General Mills and Chase Bank. And as is typical with any agreement, there's a provision that says, we can't make any modifications unless majority of banks have agreed to it. So this would be, for example, there might be a technical default rule that says, the General Mills is in violation of our credit agreement if their EBITDA to debt ratio falls below some threshold. And if you familiar with this literature, for example, like Roberts and Sufi say that about 90% of loans end up being renegotiated. And so this part of the contract stipulates who has to be on board for these renegotiations. And in this agreement, it's people holding 51% of the outstanding principal have to agree to any contract waivers. And in other cases, we end up with like supermajority rules and so on. So what this paper is about is looking at, well, what drives the voting rules? For example, when we see, the most common thresholds are either 51% or a 2/3 majority, and then there's some smattering therein. So what drives the choice of, especially like when you end up with these stricter voting rules? And we use a model based on Bolton and Sharfstein's 96 JBE paper to develop our hypotheses, and then take that to the data and test them. And we find that at least some drivers of these voting rules are agency problems with the lead lender. So the way that we model that is that the lead lender might have incentives to be lenient with the borrower. So for example, in order to get subsequent business and so on. So that's associated with stricter voting rules, and also higher default risk is associated with more lenient voting rules, which may sound kind of unusual, but when we get to the model, you'll see that a big driver of the voting rules is not, say, like true default, but the borrower strategic default. So in a sense, like diverting resources from the loan and saying we can't pay back the loan and then later renegotiating. And so in order to sort of shut that down, the contract will have really strict voting rules. Strategic default is less of a problem when there's actual, like a true default risk. And so that's associated with more lenient voting rules. So that's the paper in a nutshell. And then, to get into the guts of it. So my background is mostly in theory. So I'm going to start out with the model, and then we'll get into the empirical design. So as I mentioned, the model is pretty straightforward. It's an extension of Bolton. And I know my handwriting is bad, Sharfstein. And it's a 1996 Journal of Political Economy. So in the model at time one, the firm borrows K dollars to fund a project. There's some interim time period where there's a cash flow of either X or 0. And then at that time, the project can either be continued and you'll realize a cash flow Y, or the lenders sort of take over the project and give it to another manager to realize a somewhat lower cash flow alpha Y. And then at time 3, if the project is continued, you realize this terminal cash flow. And then when you look at the contract, it stipulates loan payments and then probability of turning over to the new manager. So when the interim cash flow is X, you have a payment of R sub X to the lenders, and then some probability beta sub X of turning over to the new manager. And when the interim cash flow is 0, there's some payment R sub 0 to the lenders and some probability beta sub 0 of turning over the firm to the new manager. And in equilibrium, we're going to have beta X is equal to 0. So when you have the positive cash flow and you pay the sort of the face value of the loan to the lenders, they'll never take over the project. And then R sub 0 is going to be 0 because in that case, the manager is claiming they don't have any money to pay to begin with. Daniel, can you mute your mic? Oh.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the timeline. Did somebody have a question? All right, so that's the timeline. And then sort of the payoff tree. So we have some probability theta of having the high cash flow. When you have the high cash flow, the manager can either truthfully say they had the high cash flow, they make a payment to the lenders, and then the shareholder gets the cash flow plus the continuation payoff minus the payment to the lenders. And then the lenders get the face value, this R sub X, and then in parentheses, the lead lender gets this extra payoff delta Y. And this is sort of our addition to the Bolton and Sharfstein model. And this would be our agency cost with the lead lender. And so what that would be is, something like the lead, in order to get new business and so on, might have incentives to be lenient with the borrower and not seize control of the project, even if the borrower defaulted. So whenever the borrower continues the project, the lead lender gets this payout. And then the borrower could also, if you have the high cash flow, lie and then pay out nothing and say, I don't have any, I can't pay the loan, even though they can. And in that case, with probability beta naught, or let's say start off with probability beta naught, that project's going to be turned over to the new manager. And then with 1 minus beta naught, they still let the firm keep the project. In that case, if the firm continues the project, they get the cash flow X plus the continuation payout Y. And then if the lenders say they're going to terminate, remember here, the borrower didn't make a payout on the loan, so they get the payout at X. And then this S, which is going to play a role in the model, is the lenders say they're going to terminate the project and give it over to the new manager. And then the borrower is going to say, well, wait a second, let's renegotiate. And then they get this payoff S. And I'm not going to get into that in the presentation because it would take too long, but it's basically like their Shapley value from renegotiation that's going to be determined in equilibrium. But you never get to that stage. That's why with the lender payoff in equilibrium, the contract's going to be such that the manager will always tell the truth when they have that payoff of X. Okay, then when probability 1 minus theta, the interim cash flow is 0. And in that case, the borrower has no choice but to make the 0 payment to the lenders. With probability beta, they terminate the project and give it over to the new manager. And then the lenders are going to get this payoff L naught. And that, similar to that payoff S with the manager, that's determined based on Shapley values and so on and based on renegotiation. I'm not going to get into the guts of that in the presentation. But it's basically, when the lenders negotiate with this new manager, that's sort of like how much value they can extract from that process. And then if they let the project continue, then the lead lender gets this payoff delta Y. Okay, so that's the payoffs. And then when we're looking at how the contract is set up, if you look at from the perspective of the non-lead lenders, with probability theta, you follow this chain, they're going to get this payoff R sub X. And then with probability 1 minus theta, if they let the project continue, the non-lead lenders get nothing. But then with probability beta naught, they're going to get this payout from their negotiations with the new manager. So that's going to be the non-lead lender's payoff. And then that has to weekly exceed the loan amount K that they're giving. So that's going to be sort of the break-even constraint that determines the loan amount. And it's always the non-lead lenders that dictate this, because when you look at the lead lender, they also get, when the project continues, they're going to get this payoff delta Y. And then when there's the low payout with probability 1 minus beta naught, they again get this delta Y. So the lead lender, because of this agency cost, have a strictly higher payoff than the non-lead lenders. So any face value that satisfies the non-lead lenders is going to satisfy the lead lender. And as an aside, this gives some example of how even the lead lender is benefiting from being in the syndicate. Because what would happen if, let's say if it was only the lead lender as a single bank lending to the firm would be able to set a lower face value to, in a sense, extract that private benefit delta Y from the non-lead lender, or from the lead lender. But with the non-lead lenders on board, the face value has to be high enough to satisfy them. And then that allows the lead lender to sort of, keep some value from their private benefit. Okay, so any questions on the payoffs here? Like I'm going pretty fast. All right, so in equilibrium, when the shareholders have this interim cash flow X, if they tell the truth that they had X and they pay, they get this X plus Y minus the face value. If they lie, there's this probability that they'll continue and they get X plus Y, or this probability that the lenders take over and then they get, you know, this renegotiation payoff S. And so in order to get the firm's managers to tell the truth, then this face value has to be less than this default or this takeover probability beta naught, you know, times the continuation payoff Y minus their renegotiation payoff S. Okay, so that's one, you know, condition for equilibrium for truth telling. And then to get money, like I said, it's the non-lead lender that's going to determine the face value. And so for them, their payoff, you know, if we take the face value from the non-lying constraint and substitute it into the non-lead lender payoff, they need to get at least enough to break even on their loan amount. And so that gives this liquidation probability beta naught, you know, which is a function of, you know, the truth telling constraint, you know, when you have the positive cash flow S, and this is, and then it's also determined by what do the non-lead lenders get in the case where, you know, that L naught is their payoff from renegotiating with the new manager. And then the ultimate payoff to the shareholders is then, you know, this theta X. So this is the probability that they get the positive cash flow. First best, they continue, and then you have the cost of the project, and then it subtracts this efficiency loss. And when we're setting voting rules, that's going to be focused on, you know, how do we minimize that efficiency loss?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Timothy Shields. I'm not sure if this is the right audience for this, but can you give me some quick intuition why the truth-telling constraint binds, and so you can replace Rx in the second constraint?
Well, let's say if it didn't bind.
Yeah, I mean, why does Rx have to equal that rather than just be less? That's what I want to know.
Well, let's say hypothetically that it was less than that. You can actually see here on the shareholder payoff. So that would mean, so if we look at our efficiency loss, so we want to have that liquidation probability as low as we can. So if there was slack in that truth-telling constraint, then we could lower the probability of the lenders taking over the project and reduce the efficiency loss. And then make it bind.
Okay, so it just binds at maximization.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
In equilibrium, it's always going to bind because, like, if it's not, you could reduce the efficiency loss. Okay, and then from the and then in terms of you know, why is it going to bind on the non-lead lender? I mean, that's just because the shareholders want to pay the lenders as little as possible. Yeah. Okay, so when we look at this efficiency loss, so first in this, you know, in that beta now, we have two things going on in the case of liquidation. When the manager lies, they have this payoff S, that's the blue line. And then when the lenders are negotiating with the new manager, they have this red curve L naught. And this V, that's that's the voting threshold. Okay, so first you can see that the shareholders' payoff to lying is always strictly decreasing in that. And the reason is that, as you increase that voting threshold, as it goes from 0 to 1, there's more and more lenders that you have to sort of bribe in order to let you keep the project. And the more you have to bribe the lenders, that's obviously going to reduce, how much money the shareholders get to keep for themselves. Okay, so that one is pretty straightforward, what that would be decreasing. And then when you look at the lender's liquidation payoff, this guy here, that gets maximized with the simple majority rule. The V equals 1/2. And so in that case, when you start going beyond the 1/2, it gives the lenders enough sort of bargaining power to take some money from the new manager. But when you start increasing above 1/2, then you start getting lenders again, like holding out and trying to extract rents. And then what ends up happening there is, the lenders may get more when there's a renegotiation, but if you take too much money from the new manager, they're not going to want to engage in the buyout to begin with. And so then, that's why you start getting this decreasing point. It's like a benchmark might be, well, why not set a simple majority rule? What's going to push us above a simple majority rule is so we see, like, if we didn't care about this beta naught, this liquidation probability, when we look at this L naught, we would just set V equals to 1/2. That makes the L naught as big as possible, and it's going to reduce that part of the efficiency loss. But if we look, the liquidation probability in equilibrium is still decreasing as we go to stricter majority, and that's coming from this guy. So by increasing the majority rule, we sort of decrease the borrower's lying payoff, and then that makes us, by reducing the payoff to lying, we reduce the propensity for a strategic default. And then when you're less worried about strategic default, then you can, not have such a big threat of taking over the project. And so that's decreasing. And so from a simple majority rule, we could increase the threshold a bit and then reduce this liquidation probability. And so that gives us our overall efficiency loss, which is this blue line on the right-hand side. And so our optimal voting rule is going to be greater than 1/2. And again, that's driven by using the supermajority rules to reduce the shareholders' payoff from a strategic default. All right, so questions on that before I summarize the predictions that we get out of this. All right, so that's basically the setting that's giving us our empirical predictions. So we have the voting threshold is increasing in agency costs with the lead lenders. So that's our delta parameter in the model. And so in our empirical test, we proxy for low agency costs as prior relationships within the syndicate. And so in that case, when there's high relationships within the syndicate, we expect sort of like this V, the voting threshold, to be somewhat lower. And the rationale there is when when there's prior relationships among the syndicate, then the lead lender will be somewhat more concerned with reputation. With the syndicate members, it's going to be more likely to sort of side with them rather than with the borrower. And then that's going to sort of reduce their tendency to be lenient. And so then you don't need such a high voting threshold. And then we proxy with high agency cost as like prior underwriting relationships with the borrower. And so and then there's empirical evidence of this, is that, you have banks that have an investment banking arm and a commercial banking arm, or even in investment bank, they might be sort of like lenient as the lead arranger, and then in an exchange for that, they're on more friendly terms, and they maybe get underwriting business for issuing bonds or shares of equity and so on. And so I would say like that's like our main predictions on the agency relationships. And then we also have the threshold for voting is decreasing in the number of lenders. And so the rationale here is that as you increase the number of lenders, that decreases the amount of rents that the shareholders can extract, if they have a strategic default. And so when they get less money in a strategic default, it's less tempting. You don't need to use this big hammer of the voting threshold to deter it. And so you can have a more lenient threshold. And then it's also decreasing in the default risk. So when there's a higher default risk, there's less of a chance of a strategic default, and you don't need the voting threshold. And then this one, the one with the default risk, this is also in Bolton and Sharfstein. We're not aware of anybody that's tried to test that. But they also have this prediction on the default risk. The other two predictions on the number of lenders and the agency cost, that's unique to our model because you need the agency costs with the lead arranger in order to get those predictions. Okay, so that's it on the model section of the paper. So any questions on that before we move into the tests and the empirics? Okay, so quiet crowd. I'm used to having a couple of black eyes by this point in the presentation.
I'll ask a clarifying question then.
Okay.
What was beta again? The probability of what action?
Let me go back. So what the beta is when the borrower says they're not going to pay the agreed upon threshold, beta, that's the probability that the lenders take over the project and give it to a new manager.
Oh, okay. So
that'd be like they exercise their rights in a default. So you can think about one minus beta not being, that's the probability that the firm sort of defaults, but then the lenders renegotiate and leave the current management in place. Whereas beta not would be the firm defaults and then the lenders remove the current set of managers and then bring in somebody new.
Gotcha. So the representative lender is playing like a mixed strategy. So they've got to be indifferent between the two, right?
No, this is, I mean, this is
that's where I'm getting lost.
It's not like a mixed strategy. It's actually that's sort of set in advance, that's a feature of the Bolton and Sharfstein model, which is kind of strange in the sense of they agree in advance to these that's known ex ante what these probabilities are. So it's not playing a mixed strategy.
Okay, so that you've got a group of people committing to probabilistically terminate and negotiate and continue. I hear you, but it sounds impossible that you could get like a group of lenders all together and decide that we're gonna, almost flip a coin at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree, and even like with working on this paper, I'd actually written a different model where these decisions are all made ex post. And in that case, it works a little bit differently. There's no like mixed strategies or anything, but you still need the voting threshold. In that case, so when everybody's just working like what's like ex post beneficial to themselves, the lead lender is still going to be is still going to have incentives to continue. And then you use the voting thresholds in a sense to empower the non-lead lenders who do not have this private benefit. And you get really similar outcomes. And while I think that sort of setting is a bit more intuitive. The reason why we didn't go with that in this paper, it's more of purely pragmatic in the sense it's like a little bit easier to say, okay, we're just going to like make a jumping off point from this sort of well-regarded JPE paper, add our thing into it and get our predictions, rather than introduce this whole like entirely new model. So it would seem maybe too much like reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, plus you'd have another set of reviewers you have to satisfy, plus the archival guy.
Yeah, so it's in a sense that,
So
but you do get similar results. I mean, the setup is a little bit different. It's not like I didn't have it like with the binary payoffs and all that stuff, but with a similar thing in the sense of like the lead arranger like has some benefit from continuing, and then you use the voting. And then in that case, there's not like all the Shapley values and stuff going on. It's more that you're using the voting thresholds to empower these non-lead lenders that don't have the private benefits. And then they sort of act as like the disciplining and device to keep the managers and the lead lenders from doing things that are inefficient ex ante, but are efficient ex post after they borrowed the money.
Gotcha. So maybe there'll be something in the data that gives some insight as to whether they're acting this way, or maybe instead of like one particular entity doing this with some probability, you can think of it as the probability you get one type or another across all lending consortiums, and the model would make sense either way.
Yeah. Yeah, in that case, but again, it's not like mixed strategies. We could say there's like some distribution of types.
Well, yeah, I understand that.
That's usually when I think of like this continuum of types, and then you're like drawing from that, it behaves more like that.
But it's still a choice, right? I decide to continue or to terminate. So picking one of those choices with a probability feels like a mixed strategy.
Yeah, and it's and I agree that I agree that it's like kind of weird.
Okay, let's stop theory wonking out and get to the data then.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Okay, so our basic specification is we have two different proxies for the amendment threshold. One is just like the straight amount, and then the other is what percentage of, like, let's say if you have like 10 lenders, what fraction of those 10 lenders have to be on board in order to get a change to the contract. And then your independent variable, it's going to be either some proxy for agency costs, and then we have number of lenders and or default risk, and then battery of controls, and then battery of fixed effects, so like loan type, lender, borrower, fixed effects, those types of things. And then in terms of our data, so we're working with syndicated loans from DealScan. Our main test have this roughly 26,000 loans, and these we can use just like a straight threshold. And then in this, when we're looking at which percentage of lenders have to be on board, we're working with this smaller subsample of about 11,000. And the reason for that is a lot of the loans in DealScan, they'll say we need, say, 51% of the dollars to vote to approve an amendment, but we don't know how many lenders it takes to make up 51%, because they don't give like the individual lender's share. But then for some of the loans, they'll say lead bank has 30%, and then the other banks, the other 7 banks have 10% each. And then for those, we can compute sort of how many lenders have to be on board for a change. And then that's our sample of 11,000. Okay, so that's our basic data. So I'm not going to go through summary statistics. So I'm just going to jump right into our results. So here, I have the gobbledygook. That's the Shapley value S to the shareholders when they default. And so first off, the role of the voting rule, it's appearing twice, but what's really driving it is this guy. So as you increase the majority required, that's going to decrease sort of their lying rent. And then in terms of where the agency costs come into play, as we can see, the agency costs increase that lying rent. And so you're going to use a higher threshold in order to mitigate that. And the data largely support that. So the syndicate relationship intensity, remember, that would be low agency costs, because that delta is how much does the lender want to cooperate with the borrower. And so when there's a high, the syndicate relationship intensity is like how much has the lead arranger worked with the other syndicate members in the past. So it's like somewhat of proxy for the reputational costs. So when they have these strong bonds within the syndicate, they're going to be less likely to cooperate with the borrower and more likely to kind of side with the syndicate member. So that's low agency costs. And consistent with that, for both of our proxies, we see this negative relationship with the voting threshold. And then past underwriting by the lead arranger, that's a proxy for high agency cost. And then with that, we see positive relationship with the voting threshold. So it looks like we indeed have these predicted relations between the agency costs with the lead arranger and the setting of the voting thresholds. So it does look like these considerations of agency costs, the lead lender, and strategic defaults might be playing a role in explaining how are we setting these voting rules in the debt contract. And then also the number of lenders, that has a negative relation. I know this guy looks funny. It's like, how do you get a significant coefficient of with the 0? So what it is, it's like 0.00000. It's like a tiny coefficient, but it's statistically significant at the 1% level. So when you have a higher number of lenders, you tend to have more lenient voting thresholds. And again, what's going on there is that when you have a lot of lenders, if hypothetically the borrower wanted to have a strategic default, they would have to keep a lot of people happy in order to get approval on letting the managers maintain control of their project. And then that's going to sort of take away their benefit. That's going to make them not want to lie to begin with. And then you can use a more lenient voting threshold. It's in a sense, the number of lenders themselves are enough to deter a strategic default. You don't need to use a strict voting threshold to deter it. But I would say that that's probably like our main result on the voting threshold. And then one other thing, and then ask for any other questions. Now, some of these, especially like the number of lenders, you could also, this agency costs in the model, that's not the only thing that could explain that. I mean, so you could have other things going on, as we mentioned in the paper, like renegotiation costs. If you have a lot of lenders, renegotiation becomes more costly. So that might be another reason why you would use a lower threshold with a lot of lenders, is because you don't want to have, to herd, like 20 different people to agree on something. Whereas like, let's say if you have very few lenders, maybe you can set a high threshold because, you only have like 3 people that need to agree. And so it's not so costly to have a high threshold. Okay, any questions on that before I move on to the next sort of set of results on default risk? Okay. Okay, next set of results pertain to the effects of the default risk. And this doesn't have so much an effect on the strategic default, at least not a direct effect per se. A lot of this is coming through what's the face value set at. So if you recall, for the non-lead to break even, how we're going to set the face value is the face. So this RX, that would be like the face value. And that has to, be at least equal to the loan amount plus, this would be, whatever the premium they get. It's like, what would they get to get their loan back versus the, their payoff when there's a default. And so when you have a higher theta, so that, remember, theta is the probability of the high payment. Then you have a lower face value, which means a lower, and when the face value is lower from the non-line constraint, we can also reduce this, the probability of the lenders taking over beta naught. Or if we look at it in terms of default risk, if 1 minus theta, if the default risk increases, then you're going to need a higher face value to compensate for that. And when the face value is higher, you're going to want to have also a higher probability of liquidating to keep the manager from lying. Because you raise the face value, then the manager by itself, the manager is going to have an incentive to say, well, I don't want to pay that face value, so why don't I just lie and say I don't have any money. Increasing this liquidation probability beta naught is what stops that. So then what that is saying is that, well, if you do lie, let's say you don't have any money, we're going to have a higher chance of taking over the project and kicking you out and getting a new manager. And so then the manager says, okay, well then I'm not going to lie. And if you recall from those graphs on the previous thing, this beta naught, that threshold, is decreasing in the voting rule. So if we want to have a higher, let me do that in a different color. So if we want to have a higher voting threshold, we need to reduce, or if we want to have a higher default probability, we need to, in equilibrium, then we need to reduce the voting rule. Okay, so here we have the test of that. So first, the loan spread, this would be a proxy for higher default risk or a lower theta. And the reason is, like, loan spread has like default risk is probably the biggest driver of that. And so with the, and then I'm just going to put this last step. And so with a higher default risk, we had to predict a more lenient voting threshold. And then so we see, we see that in columns 1 and 4. The KZ index, that's a financial constraint index. And so this would be associated with lower default risk. All right, so higher KZ index, they have more access, they have lower financial constraints, so they have lower default risk. which means that theta is higher, which means the voting threshold should be higher. So columns 2 and 5 are consistent with that. And then investment grade bonds, this is kind of like the opposite of the loan spread. So investment grade bonds have lower default risk. Which we would predict means more strict voting thresholds. And we again find that in columns 3 and 6. And this is one that I would say is like kind of hard prediction to get without the model. You know, I think, for example, like with a number of lenders, like just looking at like renegotiation costs and so on, you could see how that might, you know, high number of lenders might lead to like a more lenient threshold. But, you know, it's hard to work out, you know, without a model, you know, how would the default risk relate to the voting threshold? So this I think is a pretty nice result and an example that, you know, by working through the equilibrium and so on, you know, we could get some nice predictions that, you know, hold up pretty well in the data. It's nice. It's nice when it works out like that. And this particular prediction, as I mentioned before, this is one that you could get just out of the original 96 Bolton and Sharfstein paper. The default risk is not unique to our model, whereas the previous slide stuff was. Is there any questions on this table before we look at another test related to the default risk?
Quick question. I guess you're running like panel data because I see a lender fixed effect here.
Yeah.
Would it make sense to run these things with like a consortium fixed effect rather than just a lead lender fixed effect? The behavior of the lead lender might differ depending on what group of partners they're in.
Oh, yeah, I'd have to ask my co-authors about that, but I think that could be problematic because let's say if you require like a consortium, you could end up in a situation where each consortium only has like 1 or 2 loans. Because let's say that, you know what I mean? Because you know, so there might be like some usual suspects, like Bank A always works with Bank B, but then sometimes Bank C is on board, but that's only for 1 loan, and then Bank D is on board for another loan. And so, you know, we might end up have a problem with like the number of fixed effects is really close to the number of observations.
And the other thing, here's Daniel, just building on what Judson was saying, is that those consortiums, they can be like very big. Sometimes you have like 50 lenders on a loan. So in order to implement that, I think that's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I could see that. At the same time, I'm thinking, okay, so lender B is in a consortium where the lead lender is, you know, A, and also in another consortium where the lead lender is C. So their behavior is obviously not independent. So I can't even wrap my head around what this variance covariance matrix is going to look like, because not all your observations are going to be independent if you have different lenders in different consortiums. Anyway,
yeah, but
I have no solution.
Yeah,
sorry
just because like
that.
I think the exact composition of the syndicate on any given loan varies so much. Yeah, I don't know.
But I mean, we kind of try to exploit that by looking at like the relationship between the lead arranger and the participants in the loan syndicate. So I think that should address a little bit your concern.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to do this. I just worry that, do you really have that many independent observations, given I might have a bank that's in many different consortiums, and there's no way to, at least to my knowledge, control for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I'm not sure. I don't know that it's too. So I think having like the lead fixed effects probably does like, let's say hypothetically, if it is the case that there's a lot of stickiness to the consortiums, then in a sense, the lead lender fixed effects would pick that up anyway. Then the lead lender fixed effects, let's say if they always work with the same group, then the lead lender fixed effects would be acting like a fixed effect for that particular group.
True, but if some of the members of that group are also in other consortiums, that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah,
And-
so like,
and-
so like Chase like behaves different when they're in a thing with JP Morgan than they do when they're in a thing with I don't know, Wachovia.
Well, if they did act differently, it's less of
Yeah.
a problem. The thing is if Chase acts a certain way and it affects the consortium's decision that they're in, then you'd want to control for that. Possibly, I don't know. Like I'm sitting here trying to like look at the variance covariance matrix, and I just can't even write it out at this point.
Yeah, I think so. Henry had his hand up. I see.
He's much wiser than I.
Yeah, I mean that's I wouldn't go so far, but I guess I was thinking not of jumping to the variance covariance matrix, but just of thinking where important variation is coming from. And there's a lot of focus on the relationship, basically like pairwise relationships between the lender and the lead lender and the borrower, and then between the lead and the participants. But one thing that Timothy was sort of getting at was, what about relationships between participants across syndicates? And I guess he was talking about a variance covariance matrix. I was just thinking about basically this whole time. This is the first time I'm seeing this paper, despite overlapping considerably with the author team. But I guess I would probably have found the other model a bit more intuitive. I come at this more from thinking about like voting games and coalition formation, as opposed to finagling it into the prior literature on debt contracting, because it really seems like a coalition building game, and then there's certain aspects of the setting that affect basically what the coalition does, or what sub-coalition forms, conditional on stuff happening in the environment and the contract that was written already.
Yeah, I mean, that's in a sense, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bolden and Sharfstein paper, but I mean, that's in a sense why I went off of that, is because that's pretty much the only paper on voting rules, but they have, that's sort of what's in their paper with setting the voting rules, is getting paid based on the Shapley values based on like whatever coalitions you could be a part of and so on.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the Shapley value would reflect that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess I don't want to take up too much time, but just to again, another way to characterize Timothy's concern related to Timothy's is relationships across syndicates of participants. And I know prior literature has also looked at what happens if you're a participant in one syndicate, then you jump to being a leader in another. So there's that switch of relationships across syndicates as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll say point noted, but again, because the syndicates do vary so much from loan to loan, I don't think we could do that with like a fixed effect, but yeah, we'll have to think about it. What effect it could have, if any.
I guess another thing is I wonder how much you can do with controls for participant characteristics. I agree with you that it's not feasible, or you just run into a combinatorial problem of maybe there's a couple syndicates that happen to have the exact same members across a couple. I mean, maybe you could look at the top 2 or 3, but I don't know if there's holdings information, allocation across the syndicate members in the data. But
Yeah, well, I think in a sense, like it'd be the opposite problems. Like if the syndicates are really sticky, then then the lead lender fixed effects take care of that. The real problem is like, let's say if we had a fixed effect, like for each syndicate, that might be a fixed effect in a sense for each observation.
Yeah,
Because
totally
the
agree.
syndicate, the syndicate might not be exactly the same between any two observations.
Right. I guess, and maybe this is a completely separate point, but going back to the Shapley value, I wonder if there's an implicit assumption, again, not related to doing fixed effects. I don't think it's feasible to do syndicate level fixed effects. But I'm curious if the Shapley value is assuming that all of the participants are essentially are equal to each other. And I guess there's a concern, and this is sort of getting back to, I think, Timothy's earlier point where, and maybe your previous model, like it's not necessarily that you have randomization at the participant level of strategies, but you can imagine when the lead is forming a syndicate, they choose whether to pick up someone who's relatively harsh as a syndicate member or relatively lenient, and they're going to have different probabilities of, or whatever the beta naught is, they're going to have different effects on the syndicate level beta naught. But
yeah, that we've not looked at. That I can tell you. I think that would be worth looking at as like agency costs with the participants. Like right now, the model, the lead is the only one that has an agency cost. I can't tell you that you need some people without agency costs. And the reason for that is like, let's say if it's related to a comment I made earlier, like let's say if you had only the lead lender, then the borrower would extract all the continuation benefits from the lead by a low face value because the lead effectively has a lower break-even constraint. And so you need some of these sort of like disinterested syndicate members in order to get a high enough face value that the lead lender can keep some of the private benefits. But it probably would be worth looking at having agency costs with some of the syndicate lenders in regard to like all lenders being created equal. There was yet another version of the model that was very closely related to this one, where I modeled, so like here when I'm computing the Shapley values and so on in the model, it's based on like all the lenders being equal. So there's another version of the model where I had the lead lender has its own share, and then all the non-lead lenders are the same, and then the voting threshold is based on like dollar amount. And in that case, because the lead has a different share than everybody, the lead does behave differently. So it does take that into account. In that case, you get pretty much the same results. The big difference is that the proofs for the model, and then there's like a couple of special cases depending on whether the lead has greater or less than 1/2 of the voting or of the loan proceeds. You get a bunch of different stuff. So it's like, that became like another like pragmatic concern where it's like, do I want to add 4 more pages of derivations and proof for something that gets the same result in the end?
right, yeah.
But so I do know that we get the same results, at least when you let the lead be different than everybody else. And I have not looked at what happens when where you have heterogeneity within the non-lead. In all the cases I've looked at, the non-lead lenders have all been clones.
Yeah. So I guess what one thing that comes to mind, and forgive me if I don't really remember the time constraints, but
Up to an hour and a half. So that's fine.
oh, good Lord. Okay, so
Not an hour and a half more, an hour and a half total, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. No, still. I'm blanking on the paper, but there was an influential paper on tender offers and how much value the holdouts can capture. I can look it up and get back to you, but it's something I haven't looked at since the PhD program. But it seems like that sort of thing could be important in the syndicates. And, you know, when building a syndicate, how much do you want to add a member who's potentially going to be creating holdup problems? Because the waiving covenant seems very similar to agree or disagree with tender offers.
Yeah, they seem to have a similar flavor.
And then this is the last thing, and it's totally unrelated to everything we've talked about so far. So, you know, apologies for that. But given that I think the mean number of lenders is about 10 in the syndicate, 10 or 11, if I read the descriptive statistics correctly. So I wonder if there's the potential for some fancier econometrics. This might just be something that would be fun to do, where it seems like a setting where, especially when the dependent variable is something like percent of lenders required, if you've got 10, then there's going to be bins that are equivalent from a loss function perspective for the syndicate. At least if you take the number of syndicate members as fixed. So, you know, like 90% is going to be the same as 92%. And I wonder if there's a way to deal with that in the loss function. Definitely not like a need to have, much more of a nice to have, but could be a sort of interesting way to bring that kind of like set identification in, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to go that route, I think it would be more just like keeping the observations that have a 51% threshold and with a 2/3 threshold, and then having it be a binary choice between those.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than the bins, because when you look at it, I think it's in our sample, I think it's like over 90% of the loans have either 51% or a 2/3 threshold. So
okay.
a lot of our tests are really, it's almost behaving like a linear probability model.
Yeah, sort of like an ordered logit in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, and then the downside with that is like fixed effects don't get along so nicely with maximum likelihood models.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then the next test we have on default risk is we're using this oil price shock in 2014 as a test to sort of separate companies. And the idea here is, so this is a plot showing the pretty dramatic drop in oil prices. And when you think about a shock like this, if you're an oil industry, this is bad. But for everyone else, this is good. Everything becomes cheaper for all the people that use oil and plastics and anything derived from oil. But then for the oil companies themselves, it's bad news. And so we use this in a difference in difference test, and the idea is that this is going to be a shock that increases the default risk for the oil industry and then reduces it for everybody else, and see what happens to loans around this threshold. All right, so here's our results, and we get sort of mixed support for that. So when we look at our main variable of interest, it's this interaction between the post October 2014 and oil and gas industry. So for one of our proxies, the percentage of lenders required to be on the loan, that does decrease in the post period. So that's consistent with the higher default risk, resulting in more lenient thresholds. But then when we look at the straight amount, we get insignificant results. So this test, it's a nice test design. So I would say this provides somewhat like weak support for this relation between the default risk and the loan threshold. So we don't see anything that's contradictory. We don't see any like positive significant results. And then, in a couple of specifications, we see negative significant results. That's the second test we had on default risk. And then our last couple of results, these are more descriptive, not so much based on the model. So in table 8, we look at the relation between the non-lead holdings and the voting threshold. And we see a positive relationship there. And so the idea that we're looking at is, well, when you have like really high non-lead holdings, are these syndicate participants demanding a high voting threshold to make sure that they have to be on board with any covenant waivers and so on in order to protect their investments? We find evidence consistent with that. And then we look at the relationship between covenant types and the voting thresholds. So performance covenants, we see a negative relationship with the voting threshold. Capital covenants, a positive relation. This negative relationship, this would be somewhat consistent with renegotiation costs. And where this is coming from is there's a paper by Christensen and Nikolaev, 2012, that says that these performance covenants tend to be renegotiated really frequently. So when you have these frequently renegotiated covenants, they tend to have a more lenient threshold. In that same paper, Christensen and Nikolaev argues that these capital covenants are more oriented around agency costs. And in that case, it would look like these capital covenants have somewhat of a complementary relationship with the voting thresholds in terms of controlling agency costs with the borrower. Okay. That's that. And then the last, we look at, well, what effect does a threshold have on future amendments? So the percentage of lenders required, when there's a high percentage of lenders required, that has a negative relationship with the future amendments. So it does indeed, when you have a high threshold, it does indeed reduce the likelihood that you're going to get agreement on a waiver. And then when we look at just the threshold amount, just like the percent term for the full sample, it's negative, but it's insignificant. So this is, I'd say like weak support that the higher thresholds do ultimately reduce the likelihood of amending the loan agreement. So then I'll wrap up and then I'll stay on if there's any like follow-up questions. But the data we find are pretty consistent with the model's predictions. So the model said that the voting thresholds should be higher when there's higher agency costs. And we see that in the data where you have these strong within syndicate relationships that should lower the lead lender's agency cost. We see more lenient voting thresholds. And then when the lead lender has a stronger relationship with the buyer, we see higher voting thresholds. And then we also see voting thresholds are decreasing with the default risk. And I think there's, this is, as far as I know, like the first empirical paper studying these voting rules, in terms of like future work, this is all, I'd say, like shedding light on the relationship. We don't have any like exogenous shock to agency cost or the syndicate composition that would let us get a causal test. So that'd be an opportunity for future work to see if these agency costs are really what's driving the voting rules, and also seeing like relating back to accounting. Does say high quality reporting or other disclosure provide sort of a less costly way to reduce these agency costs? Because these voting thresholds, these are kind of a costly way of dealing with agency problems within the syndicate, because in a sense you're using these like inefficient, sort of taking over the company and giving it to a new manager in order to provide discipline within the syndicate. And then also, the presence of these lead lenders, it creates this risk of the, having the inefficient sort of take over the company. So then, that's costly. So then what are the offsetting benefits? That's it that I had. And then if there's any, I'll stay on if there's any follow-up questions. And then I posted in the chat the link to I just posted the paper in SSRN this morning, in case any of you want to look at the working paper version of it. And that's it.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Judson, for your contribution and for your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Right now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Judson Caskey, for your contribution. Thank you very much. And that's all that remains for me to say is thank you everyone that joined us. And I thank you very much for taking the time out to present it to us today, dear Professor Judson Caskey. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Hey, Judd.
Yep.
I had a really, thought out for 12 seconds idea. But how accounting might affect this is if accounting can somehow, with some probability, make the truth-telling constraint irrelevant because it discloses what's going on, then you could possibly model what would the effect of accounting be on like this, the proxy for, not the proxy, the face value or the interest rate. And these thresholds you're talking about, right? You could model it as if, a good accounting system with some lambda probability reveals the interim outcome. And with one minus that, it reverts back to the regular model, maybe?
Yeah, and that's a good point because even like when you look at the model, like the strategic default, literally speaking, the model is the manager saying, I have money, but I'm going to lie and I don't. So that obviously can't happen. But really, the way to look at that is the manager says, takes the money and invests it, say, like in a new factory or something, but then says, business isn't going well, so I'm not going to be able to pay you back. So where high quality accounting could impact that is if it gives some indication of, say, future profitability, and then the banks could say, well, no, based on your profitability so far, it does look like you're generating a lot of money and you don't have to default. You can pay us back. And so I think, that could be, like, to the extent that the accounting is informative about the future cash flow generation from the company, that would sort of make it harder to have these strategic defaults where the managers could say, I don't think I'm going to be able to pay you back.
I agree. I haven't read the original paper, so I'm don't have an intuitive feel for how that might affect it. Anyway, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, dear Prof.
And I hope good evening / morning, day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you are very welcome. It's my pleasure. And I hope to see you soon in Egypt, dear Prof. You are very, very welcome.
Right, thank you. Right, take care.